So hello there guys, and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. I hope you're well. We are back with another race preview for the Spanish Grand Prix, and we have got not only one of our panel here with us, but we've also got a very, very special guest as well. But before we get into that, just a reminder to you guys that we are the independent F1 podcast that aims to bring you a race review and a race preview along with all the other gossip, news and events in the world of Formula One. We might not be first, but we're DNF1, and that's what matters to you guys, and that's what matters to us as well. But nonetheless, let's get into this. Joining us on the panel for this week, we have Lee Wallington, as always. Lee, thanks for coming back on the show with us. How are you doing?
Well, I'm good, thank you, Adam. You know, I always love talking about one of my favourite sports, so it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's a pleasure for me too, and other sports, obviously, we all have our own interests in them, some more closer to me, not going so well at the moment, so it's always nice to talk about F1 instead, something that can always cheer me up. And without further ado, of course, let's introduce our guest. We have arguably, probably without doubt, one of the best statisticians in Formula One and even in sport in general. It's the legendary virtual statman, Sean Kelly. Sean, first of all, thank you so much for joining us on the DNF1 F1 podcast. For the benefit of our video viewers on YouTube, joining us all the way from beautiful Monaco. And how's the scenery going, Sean? How are you?
Good evening, guys. Yeah, it's all good here. I mean, when people say how are you, I usually say another day in paradise, but it really is another day in paradise when you're here. I wish I could set it up that I could show you, but if I do that, the camera can't deal with it. You'll just get a silhouette of me. So I had to turn the camera the other way around, sadly. But I can see, if you're familiar with the geography of Monaco, out to my left is the Tête de Chien, which is the big, huge mountain that overlooks the harbour of Monte Carlo. So I'm down towards the Fontvieille side, the relatively newer part of Monaco. And as you can probably hear, Monaco soundtrack, scooters going past the window of the balcony.
Yeah, it almost feels appropriate. We should be previewing the Monaco Grand Prix. Maybe if you're lucky and you're free enough, you might be able to come back for that one as well. But
I'm going to do that. We'll do the Monaco preview from Barcelona, just to really confuse people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm expecting a big weekend for Haas that weekend, but we'll have to wait and see if that comes in. We'll have to see how good those Aston Martin upgrades will be. But anyway, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail a bit later on. But Sean, I'm really curious, obviously, about your role as a statistician with F1 in particular. How does one get into that? Is that something that you just enjoyed doing from a younger age, or perhaps did you feel that it was something that just became a career for you and you just never looked back since?
It's one of the most commonly asked questions. 3 questions I always get throughout my F1 career. How did you get that job? Can I have your job? And do you need an assistant? Those are the 3 questions I always get asked.
Well, those are my other 2.
Okay, well, we'll get into the other ones as well. How did I get into it? Well, I mean, I was, long story short, too long didn't read, a fan who got lucky. I started watching F1 in 1987 when I was 6, and I thought everyone was taking it in like I was. I thought everyone was hanging on every last detail. So I grew up thinking it was perfectly normal to know the difference between, the Lotus 1990 has 4 bars of boost and active suspension, whereas the 100T conventionally suspended 2.5 bars of turbo. I thought that's what everyone knew. And it turns out, as I got a little bit older, that not everyone was paying quite as much attention as I was. And a lot of people, when they would watch races with me on television, they would say, "You're always yelling at the television." And you say something 20 minutes before they say it. Why don't you try and get a job in it? Not least of which was my mum, who kept saying, "You should do that. Murray Walker has to retire one day." Of course, when you're a kid, you think Murray Walker will go on forever. I had an American girlfriend, and I needed a job that gave me freedom of movement. Like, I couldn't be like at an office desk because I didn't live in America at the time. So I cold called the American broadcaster at the time, which was Speed Channel, and basically gave them a big sales pitch down the phone on an out-of-phone message. I didn't even speak to the person. It took me 2 days to find the name of the person I needed to talk to. I didn't know anybody. Put the phone down and thought, that's the last we'll hear of that. And a couple of days later, he called me back, and a conversation ensued, which turned into a 4-month phone-a-thon of me calling him, saying, "What do you think? What do you think? Change your mind? Have you done it? Yeah, what do you think? You want to hire me?" Basically with me saying, "I would love to do stats for you. I think I can do a job for you." I had no previous experience. I didn't have any data science background, but I did know my history. I knew that. So eventually he hired me a month before the start of the 2003 season, and it was. I'm still certain to this day he did it to get me to stop calling him. So if I give this guy a job, even on minimal amount of money, he gave me $200 US dollars per race weekend. So that was my total income per $200. But maybe he'll stop calling if I just give him this. He'll go away. How wrong he was. 20 years later, I'm still here. So it grew from there. But that was how it started. And at the time, I had nothing to lose. I had no money anyway. So it was like, wow, I'm getting paid to watch Grand Prix. This is fantastic. What's not to love about that? And then there was a eureka moment halfway through the first season when it was like, hang on a minute. What about all the other broadcasters? They're all doing the same race. Can I sell the same services to them? And now it's turned into this thing where I work for 16 domestic TV networks. I work for F1 themselves. I supply 2 of the Formula 1 teams. I got other series calling me up and asking me to do their series as well. So I fell into it almost, but once I was there, I was like, well, you're not getting rid of me now.
That's fantastic. And I certainly wouldn't assume that this is an inspirational message to loads of people that want to be the next Sean Kelly, for example, or work in any motorsport capacity, to start harassing and constantly cold calling their local directors to try and see if they can get on there. Of course, there are obviously channels that you can go down, I imagine, these days to get into that, where perhaps they didn't exist back then. But when it comes to stats itself, obviously you've mentioned you've worked with so many broadcasters. I mean, how tough must that be? Because I imagine they're probably relying quite heavily on a lot of work and information from you. I mean, is that stuff available on something like a public domain, or is that something that you would keep to yourself in private records, for example?
Ultimately, it's publicly available, but there is so much data. You can get any data pretty much publicly available. What is the unique sales point, if you like, of what I do is boiling it down to, okay, here's the nuggets of information you need to make sure is in the broadcast. Make sure you say this, make sure you've got this. And I keep everything else on standby because not only do I prep everything in advance, but I also do a live streaming service to the broadcasters when we're on the air. So if something untoward happens, like for instance, half the field gets taken out at the first corner in Hungary last year and suddenly Esteban Ocon's in the lead, then suddenly you need, oh, wait a minute, we're doing a completely different race to what we'd planned. So then you need to have, okay, well, give me stats on French drivers, give me stats on Alpine winning in their first season, give me stats on the Enstone team, what's their history? We need all of that all of a sudden. We're doing a new race. So it's a balancing act. And I'm always acutely aware that with that amount of influence comes quite a lot of responsibility. Like I have to be very, very careful, like almost like sort of BBC television style, to try and remain impartial on all counts, because you've got to think like, okay, you can't, if your personal opinion is a driver isn't performing, you can't just say, well, he's crap. You can't just give 101 reasons why they're no good. You've also got to balance it by saying, but on the other hand, he did do this, and there is this mitigating circumstance, because you've got to, that driver might end up on the podium at the next race, and you've got to actually present both sides and say, well, yeah, he had a bad run, but. So, there's a lot of responsibility attached in firstly getting everything right, because obviously in the social media era, everybody is, ready to correct you at a moment's notice. Which is not bad, because I was that person before I started this job. So there's that, and also a sense of, be fair to all of the competitors, because ultimately they're all trying as hard as they can. They're not deliberately uncompetitive.
I mean, that's and that's always the way, isn't it, with social media? I mean, you can always put whatever stats you want out, as long as they're correct. That's the most important thing. But there's always going to be someone out there trying to fact check you left, right, and centre. And on the flip side as well, you obviously got to try and do your best to be as impartial as possible. Because I mean, I've been following you for a while, Sean, and I know there are times, particularly in 2021, of course, you're putting out a stat that's relevant to something pro Lewis or something that might have gone against him, and the same for Max Verstappen. And it's almost sort of a minefield, especially last season, when you're putting out a stat up against one driver, and then all of a sudden, the other side, whether it be Max or Lewis or any other driver, will sort of come at you thinking, oh, this is irrelevant, or they'll try and throw another stat to contradict that. And I imagine that's probably left a little bit of a savoury taste sometimes when you're trying to do your job.
Well, a lot of the times the stats they throw back at me were written by me, so in a way it's a backhanded compliment. I think you're trying to refute what I'm saying with something that I've said, because you heard that in the broadcast, and that came from me.
Did they at least give you credit for that?
Certainly not in the tweets that they're sending. No. So there is that. But I mean, I think it comes with the territory. If to work in Formula One for so many people, you have to have fairly thick skin because you're going to get rejected a lot. For every person I work for, there are 10 opportunities that I didn't get. Where I thought, oh well, do you want me to work for you? And they've said no. So if rejection and sort of being people telling you like we don't need you, you're no good or whatever. I've actually had somebody say, we don't think your work's very good. So if that stuff got to you, Twitter's probably not the place for you. So the thing is, in all instances, if somebody comes to me and says, well, what about this stat? What about that stat? Well, I've got literally all the receipts. So I can always say, well, what you're saying there is, there's incorrect context or something like that. And usually they back off at that point because they're like, oh, okay, a minute. He's, because the funniest ones is when they don't know what I do for a living. They just think I'm a random F1 fan. So yeah, when they start trying to correct me on things and I'm like, no, that's not right. This is the correct answer. So you can have fun with that. If your ego does get battered on a certain day, you think, right, I'm going to have fun with that response. Let's fact check this one. So yeah, I'm just the same as anybody else. I'm still, I'm still like, no, I'm gonna make an example of that one because I don't like how you're portraying me as like anti-Lewis or anti-Max. Actually, there's a game that goes on in Formula One is if you use Twitter on any given weekend, you have to be accused of being total Lewis fanboy and a total Max fanboy. Like you have to try and get both.
I've heard of that one. That's the real Grand Slam. Forget pole fastest lap in every lead and the win. Yeah, that's the real Grand Slam.
That's the real Grand Slam. And now, of course, you've got to get Charles Leclerc in there now. So I've got to be total Lewis fanboy, total Max fanboy, total Charles Leclerc fanboy. And hi, Charles Leclerc, if you can hear me.
Yeah, he's probably not too far from you, I'd imagine.
You might be able to hear me from the window here. Lewis is the other end of town. If you're a entertainment correspondent, Lewis lives at the other end of Monaco. I'm Daniel Fonvier. This is Daniel Ricciardo, Max Verstappen, end of town. Conveniently, they live at opposite ends of town because otherwise they might run into each other, which of course will never happen since this entire country is 3/4 of a mile long.
Yeah, you'd almost imagine that the press would literally be running around trying to find any possible way to try and get a snapshot of them bumping into each other. But there you go. I haven't seen one yet, to be fair. Not that unless they're at a racetrack together. So,
well, it's actually the Monaco authorities are very good at policing people's privacy. Like they take a dim view on people like paparazzi. Paparazzi are not a thing in Monaco, and you can just casually walk around town and see very, very famous people or very, very rich people pottering about. Like, that they could just as easily be in, Chipping Norton or somewhere like that. It's you can understand if you're in that high profile position why this is such an attractive place to live, because it does afford a community, but also privacy, which is, if you're Lewis Hamilton, that's a really difficult thing to get. I mean, he wouldn't get that in Stevenage, would he?
No.
So I do understand that. Putting aside the obvious tax thing, which is omnipresent regarding Monaco, there is also the fact of day-to-day living. Probably it's quite nice to just be able to wander around and not have like people with like 200mm lenses going all this. So that'd be good for them.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds perfect, doesn't it? On the subject of, because you were talking about obviously using stats in a crazy race like Hungary last season, which is actually something along the lines of what I was going to ask you about. I mean, do you have all sort of stats in folders and files ready for certain races, or is it stuff in your head? And even then, when you get a situation like Bottas going bowling in Hungary, does that just sort of throw everything to the wayside and you just have to throw in any sort of thing that you can find that's relevant to what's going on, i.e. a battle between Ocon and Sebastian Vettel for a race win that they should in theory be nowhere near?
Well, I love when that happens, because then you're relying on your head as much as your preparation. Because if you're prepping for a race where you think, okay, so it's Verstappen and Hamilton on the front row, like it was at most races last season, like, okay, standard fare, a lot of people who are watching at home would be able to actually foreshadow what we're going to talk about based on watching the other races in the season. But then you get a completely different race where there's, okay, the main protagonists are out, and or Monza, for instance, when McLaren are 1-2, and suddenly you're dusting off your McLaren stats from 10 years ago, which you haven't used since. yeah, I much prefer those races. So there's what I call standby stats, which is stuff that's ready to go if you're getting if there's an unusual incident. Good example is when Checo Perez was on pole in Jeddah. Instantaneous. Okay, go to the standby stat. That's the first pole ever for a Mexican driver, and it's also the longest F1 career before someone's actually got a pole position. So those are in perpetual standby. Sainz, for instance, if Sainz wins a race or takes a pole position, you go to the standby. He's the second longest. So him and Perez would be 1-2 in those tables. So it's perennially on standby in that regard. But then there's other weird stuff, like if you end up with an Alpine leading an Aston Martin, it's like, okay, now we're using the force. Now it's like, what can we make up with this? A great example, I did the Spanish Grand Prix of 2006 for CBS Sports, which is the network broadcaster in the US, and it was an experiment. They didn't normally do F1 in the US, but they did that race, and it was a boring race. And the thing is, it has very high audience because it was network television. And it was late in the race, and I thought, well, what can we do with this order that would be interesting for American viewers? And Jenson Button and Rubens Barrichello, I think, were 5th and 6th running at that time for Honda. And I thought, well, last time, for an American audience, like last time we had 2 Hondas in the top 6, that'd be Mexico 65, when Richie Ginther won and Ronnie Buckman was in the points. Those are 2 American drivers. It was the first win for Honda, and it was the first of 368 wins for Goodyear out of Akron, Ohio, who are the all-time record holders for most wins by tire manufacturer. So it was like I statted it with American stuff just to sort of give them a bit of a jolt. So that's the sort of stuff I have to do when, like, okay, come up with something. Can you really come up with something, or is this just, are you just relying on your Excel database? You know, so that's the most fun thing to do.
Well, that's it, isn't it? I mean, I hear half of those stats, and I mean, the one about Perez, I think the only thing that I sort of knew from that was the one, obviously, that was the most races before a pole position. I think it was like the first Mexican on the sort of anywhere near the front row since Ricardo Rodriguez, or something like that, like 50, 60 odd years ago. I think
Pedro Rodriguez has been on the front row.
Yes.
But the stat as given was that Ricardo Rodriguez was the first Mexican driver in F1, and on his debut, Monza 61, he put the Ferrari on the front row. He was the only teenager on the front row until Max Verstappen. Max Verstappen beat the record at Belgium 2016, I think it was. I think so. But second in their first Grand Prix, and then no Mexican had been on pole for 61 years after that. So it was like a very long wait to move up one position.
I mean, does that surprise you, obviously, when you hear stats like that, and obviously they come full circle when Checo Perez gets his first pole position in Jeddah? Does it sort of blow your mind a little bit that it's been 60 odd years since a driver from a country with such a rich racing pedigree, particularly in the States, has managed to achieve something like a pole position in Formula One, which of course is no small feat, it must be said. Yeah,
and the fact that Perez had waited more than 11 years since his debut. In fact, I think, if memory serves me right, the race day in Jeddah was 11 years to the day since Perez had made his Grand Prix debut. So exactly 11 years after he made his debut, he started from pole position for the first time. So, you know, good things come to those who wait.
And driving in car number 11 as well, which is
driving
too bad,
in car 11. So it was, It often, there are often moments where I think, is that right? Like that just sounds too good to be true. Is that really, really what's happened here? Like, and I'll go back and I'll check it and I'll check it and I'll check it and I'll be like, the answer's the same every time. I'm convinced this is correct. I'm more confident putting that stuff out instantly now than I was when I began. In 2003, the Italian Grand Prix of 2003 was the fastest Grand Prix in history. And I was only working for the US broadcaster, Speed Channel at the time. Schumacher crossed the line. I saw the race time, because obviously the race time comes up on the graphic after they've won the race and the slowdown lap. Before the race, I had actually calculated the exact time to a thousandth of a second that they would need to hit to break the record, which was held by Peter Gethin from 1971. He was inside it. I checked, okay, average speed's just under 154 miles an hour. We threw it out on the air while Schumacher was on his slowdown lap. And then nothing for the rest of the day from all of the rest of the F1 media. And I started to get really, really like squeaky bum time. Like, I didn't just make us look like idiots by declaring this defining race in F1 history, the fastest Grand Prix in history, and maybe it wasn't. And I had to send this groveling email to the entire production staff saying, no one else has said this, and I've done the calculation 20 times, and it's the same number every time, but I have to inform you that I might be wrong because literally no one else has reported it. Now, as it was, it didn't get reported until the following day. And then it was like, okay, maybe they'll hire me again next year. Because I was thinking, like, okay, it might be my one season in the sport. And then 2 weeks later, I was eating dinner and I was next to Jean Todt and like Ross Brawn. And I was like, wow, that escalated fast.
Well, it was obviously they've sort of come in and heard of you based on that stat alone. And it's like, well, there we go. There's the legend right there. So the man that's made us famous.
Yeah, you got to get up pretty early in the morning to beat old Statman.
Lee, I'm going to bring you in this. Don't worry. I know you've been sort of sitting there patiently. I want to get your opinion, Sean, on the 2022 cars, because I know something that's always been intriguing me is something that in 2022 that's been emphasised a lot and focused on since the rules were announced was how close the field was going to be, because they wanted to bunch up the field, this field spread that we heard. Now, I've been following the sport since the mid-90s, and even then I knew that the field spread was quite wide, and it was even wider back in the days of the late 80s when Senna and Prost were dominating in the McLaren together. In your opinion, and maybe there's stats to back this up, I'm sure that you'll probably have fresh to memory, is the field now at a point where the 2022 regs have, at the very least, closed the pack up to levels that perhaps we've never seen before in F1? Because for me as a fan, I feel like it kind of has in that regard and has achieved that, even if it's not as close as everyone within a second of each other.
Well, it's important to stay in context that whenever there's a major set of rule changes, it always pushes the field apart. It never closes the field up initially because everyone interprets the rules differently. And so you get a shake up in the order, you know, what the car that was fastest is no longer the fastest, as Mercedes have found out. But they might fix it and become fastest because they're still grappling with how the regulations actually work best. So it's not unusual that there's a change in the order and also that the gaps will get a little bigger. What happens is there's a sort of migration towards the mean as those regulations stay stable. The returns become diminishing and they all get closer and closer to each other. Formula One's never been as close as this, and it is quite amusing. And I start to feel like I'm getting old. I shouldn't feel like I'm getting old, but I mean, I've been doing it 20 years, so I suppose so. When I hear people say it's got to be made closer, it's never been as close as this. And you can track it all. You mentioned you started following F1 in the mid-90s. You can track it all back to a single rule change, and that was the Max Mosley's introduction of the 107% rule in 1996. Before then, you could build an F1 car that was 10 seconds a lap off the pace and you'd get in the race. And that's what 40 did in 1995. They had a car that was essentially, performance-wise, nothing more than an F3000 car, but it would get into the race on the basis that there were 26 guaranteed grid slots and there were only 26 cars entered. So they were guaranteed to start no matter what they built. I mean, they could have put a sale on it and it would still have been allowed to race. In 1996, that changed, and you had to have a car that was a minimum 7% off of pole position or closer. And that meant the 40s started to not qualify. So now there was this kick up the ass, like you're not going to race unless the car's quick enough. And that's where we started to see the field start to close because all these tail end Charlies couldn't handle the heat anymore. They shouldn't have been in F1. I mean, Bernie used to say it should be quality over quantity. It is Formula One, and he did have a point. You can't have all these big time Charlies coming in and pretending they're an F1 team when in fact they shouldn't be there. So that was when the field started to close up. And it got, as we started to get towards Park from A regulations in 2003, you had multiple engines that had to last multiple races, gearboxes had to last multiple races. It stopped being an arms race and it started to be something where cars from midfield had a realistic chance of winning a race if something happened to the front runners. From 1980, from after Senna won his last race for Lotus, Detroit 87, until I think Olivier Panis won here in 1996 for Ligier. If I remember rightly, only 4 teams won a race in 10 years. It was Williams, McLaren, Ferrari, and Benetton. So if you think that, you know, it used to be better in the old days, no, it didn't. I was there. I could tell you it wasn't. Cars were great, sure. But in terms of the racing and how close the actual field is, it's never been better than it is now. And I know that sounds like, yeah, he would say that because he works in Formula One, blah, blah, blah. No, I can bring you the receipts that show it to you, you know. But the days of the front row being 3.3 seconds clear of third place on the grid are long gone. They're never coming back.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm sort of half remembering what race that was. It's going to come to me at some point throughout this episode. I mean, you might want to beat me to it if you want to, Sean, if I'm taking too long, but it is during the sort of the time McLarens with Senna and Prost, and
yes,
it wasn't.
Yeah, the
Monaco,
race I'm referring to was Imola 1988.
That's the one. Yes,
and Nelson Piquet was third on the grid in a Lotus Honda, same engine. Remember, same engine.
And
as
he was the
McLaren.
world champion at the time.
And he was the reigning world champion. And Lotus had won Grand Prix the previous year. He was third on the grid and he was 3.3 seconds off pole. Now that's the spread of the entire grid.
Yeah, you could easily fit the whole grid in that. Yeah,
that's the best single example of where we've come from in 30 years. 30 years ago, that was considered acceptable. It's like, oh, well, you never know what might happen in the race. Nowadays, it's like, oh my God, 3.3 seconds covers first and last. What are we going to do?
Yeah.
So it's important to keep that in context and not say it was better in the good old days. It wasn't better in the good old days. Trust me.
Yeah, I've been trying to tell that to a lot of people. I remember last year, even when Haas were as bad as they were, even they would have still fit into that spread to the lead car, being the Mercedes or Red Bull on any given weekend. But just one more question quickly, Sean, on stats before we get into the preview, or at least the meat of it. In terms of new formats in Formula One, we've had so many variations in qualifying. We've had like the one-shot qualifying, the aggregate qualifying, the qualifying when everyone had run on their race fuel, which was so much fun to watch. Now we've got sprint qualifying, or the sprint races, so to speak. Has those new formats kind of, and I want to say this right, has it sort of annoyed statisticians like yourself? Because you get an example where you have, sprint qualifying now has been amended so that counts as a pole position. But the sprint race itself still doesn't count as a win. And of course, like Max Verstappen winning the Imola race, obviously that won't go towards his overall wins total, which is growing at an exponential rate at the moment. Is that a little bit frustrating that you sort of have to create new stats which, comparing sprint race wins to actual race wins, may not actually mean much in terms of the overall accolades when comparing Max to, say, Lewis or Michael or some of the other greats when he finishes his career?
It doesn't annoy me. If anything, I don't know any fans who said, you know what would be great? Sprint qualifying. I know I never heard that expression. It always came from up above, Once we had it, the first time we did it at Silverstone, I thought, yeah, it's all right. It gives us makes Friday much more relevant. Now qualifying on Friday, suddenly Friday's a big deal again. So it did have a lot of fringe benefits. But I didn't have any objection to how it was statistically defined, because pole position, since the inception of the World Championship, is defined as the driver who is in first position on the published starting grid for the race. So as long as, it doesn't matter what the qualifying format is, as long as the driver in first place on the starting grid for the Grand Prix gets pole position, that's how we define it. And as you said, we've had a multitude of qualifying formats down the years. And not always fair, and not always defined by the driver who's quickest over one lap. You mentioned the race fuel era. You'd have many instances where a driver who's quickest in Q2 wouldn't be on pole position because they'd have different race fuel. But no one ever objected. No one looked at that era and said, well, that's all irrelevant in terms of comparing him to the Senna era, when it was all qualifying tires and 2 days of qualifying, qualifying on Friday and Saturday. So we've always had these different formats. The thing that's really irritated me, and the thing that I feel like I have sufficient authority to question this, is changing the definition of pole position, because they've opened up a whole avenue of nonsense, which they're probably not aware of. Because you're going to end up, and I tried to outline this at Imola, and we were very lucky at Imola because the front row at Imola was the same on Saturday and Sunday. So nothing changed in the record books. It's like it never happened. You could have a driver who's on pole starting last on the grid. And you're going to have to explain to people who've tuned in expecting to see Lewis Hamilton on pole why he's 15th or 16th. But hang on a minute, you said he was on pole. Yeah, he is, but pole's not first anymore. Oh, well, who's decided that? Who said that was a good idea? You could have a situation where a driver is on pole, like let's say Hamilton's on pole and Ferrari have locked out the front row. Explain that. You could have a situation where, let's say a driver comes along who breaks the all-time record, Vettel's record for youngest pole sitter of all time. Doesn't start first on the grid. So then you've got this horrible anomaly in the record books. This guy was the youngest pole sitter in history, apart from the fact he didn't start on pole.
Well, we had that last year, didn't we, with Charles Leclerc crashing in Monaco. He was meant to start on pole position, but of course was never able to start the race. So I imagine that would have confused some people tuning in, thinking, well, where's Leclerc? Why is he credited with pole position?
It might do, but that was the correct definition because he was in first place on the published starting grid. He was the expected person on pole position, and it was the entrant themselves that messed up their chances because, of course, Leclerc crashed and Ferrari thought they'd repaired the damage and hadn't. Or, well, they say it was unrelated. We may never know. Either way, it was like, okay, Leclerc's supposed to be there, but he isn't. It's not a case of Leclerc was fastest in qualifying and now he's 10th on the grid for unrelated reasons. And there are countless examples throughout F1 history, at least a dozen, of drivers who were fastest in qualifying not being on pole position. The precedent was set at German Grand Prix of 1959. Cliff Allison was fastest in qualifying. He was a reserve driver. Because he was a reserve driver, he had to start at the back of the grid. That's the first instance where someone was quickest in qualifying was not credited with pole position. We've had this all through F1 history. It's nothing new. We've had it last season with, who did we have? We had Bottas in Monza, I think it was. And I'm forgetting another one. Was it Hamilton in Turkey? I think it was.
Yeah.
Probably should do my research before I do one of these podcast appearances, really, shouldn't I? There are many examples for varying reasons of drivers quickest in qualifying not being on pole. And now we've got a situation where a driver who's quickest in qualifying is not on pole. So now you've created this whole caveat of nonsense, which you're going to have to own for the next however many decades. I would urge the powers that be to reconsider this before we get to Austria, because if they change it now back to how it should be, how it's correctly defined, how it has always been defined, we can forget this ever happened. And the driver who wins the sprint is on pole position, end of story, because that's how Sunday is supposed to work.
Yeah, it's a really strange one because I remember last year they were sort of going the other way, saying, well, what's the point of the sprint qualifying, like the actual qualifying session? That should count for something like the fastest driver should be on pole position. I mean, the strangest example I could think of from memory, and this is obviously with you here, Sean, you might be able to fact check me whether I'm right or wrong here, so I'm putting my neck on the line. But it was the 2005, was it 2005 Indianapolis where Jarno Trulli, was it in the Toyota, that got pole position, but because he didn't start the race, because of that whole controversy with the Michelin tyres, meaning that only the Bridgestone runner started, he was credited with pole position rather than Michael Schumacher, who was actually the leading car off the grid because all the others gone into the pits.
Right. Yeah, you meant the Michelin runners were the only drivers who didn't start.
Yes, that's right.
And
Sorry,
the Bridgestone drivers were the only ones who didn't start.
Yeah.
Well, here's the background on that. I was actually at that race. I thought we were going to get strung up from the rooftop. So it was the most vitriolic bad blood I've ever experienced at a racetrack. We were lucky we got out of there alive. Toyota knew going into Saturday that they weren't going to be racing. They knew that none of the Michelin guys were going to be out there. So what they did was, that was the days of qualifying on race fuel. They put 3 laps of fuel in the car and said, go and take pole position. We're not racing anyway. May as well go and get pole. So they did. So Trulli was on pole position, did not start the race, credited with pole position because, as with every other race in the history of the World Championship, he was in first place on the published starting grid. That is the only definition of what pole position has ever been. So whether he actually started the race is not relevant, just like it's not relevant for Didier Pironi at Hockenheim 82 or Jean-Pierre Jarier at Argentina 1975. They were first on the starting grid as published. Whether they actually started the race is irrelevant.
Wow, I mean, literally mind blown by half of those stats. I imagine most F1 fans, if you ask them to pick a stat out of thin air, most of them will probably turn to the fact that Nico Hülkenberg has the most race starts without a podium. And it's quite sad because I feel for Nico because he certainly probably was worthy of one, but I digress. We'll never know. Lee, for the benefit of our audio listeners, you are still here, and it's bad on my part.
Lee.
Hello.
Sorry about that.
Lee's been our audience for the first 20 minutes.
To be
It's
fair,
been entertaining and interesting.
half of those questions came from Lee anyway, so I feel I should credit him with some of those anyway. It's just sort of me being the host taking most of the credit as per usual. Sorry, dude. But look, Lee, we're going into the Spanish Grand Prix now, and the gap between Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen, 19 points, I believe it is. Yeah, it was once 46, now 19. Max has been red hot form, and it doesn't take an expert statistician like Sean to tell you that when Max finishes a Grand Prix, he usually wins, or always wins, at least this season. So what are your thoughts going into this weekend? Are we expecting another performance from Max Verstappen that is worthy of a race win, or do we think that Ferrari are going to respond at a circuit which should suit their car a little bit more?
Well, my gut's telling me Ferrari is going to respond. There are obviously all the teams are going to bring some upgrade or another. But I definitely expect Ferrari to fight back and go for the win. Well, obviously they always go for the win. That's a silly statement in itself. But I reckon they'll be the best chance to get the win. But obviously, statistically speaking, Max's run of win or not finish has to end at some point. He can't keep doing it all season.
Well, Max's consistency last season is quite scary when you think about it. I mean, it was just crazy. And there's absolutely no reason why Max can't continue to do this. Right now, the car is, they're upgrading the car.
The DNF for the win. He's got to get a second place at some point. He's not going to...
Well, this is it. It could happen this weekend, for all we know. But, I mean, look, the word of the day at the moment this week is upgrades. And Barcelona is normally the circuit where most teams bring their huge or first large cohort of upgrades, if you like, to their cars. And there's been a lot said between Red Bull and Ferrari, where Red Bull have been taking certain parts of their car and upgrading it race by race to the point where they probably have the best car right now, at least when you consider the race performance, which is obviously the important factor, versus Ferrari, who so far haven't really put anything significant on that car until this weekend, from what we've been hearing. With all that in mind, Lee, how do you see that one going down? Do you think Ferrari will turn up with the advantage at this circuit, or do you think that this could be another track that could be decided on whether or not the Ferrari can hold back that Red Bull in a straight line when they eventually come together in a fight?
Well, I think it's going to be a bit of both, to be honest. Obviously, at the moment, or as of the last race in Miami, Red Bull had the better car. That is abundantly clear to see. But the Ferrari haven't bringing any upgrades or major upgrades. They've obviously been working on this for a long time. Like all teams, a big upgrade. They've been planning it. It's probably been in development for even before the season started, about where they plan to take their car and reinforced by the testing. So whatever they're bringing, which is, I think is supposed to be the new floor, is one of the things that Ferrari are supposed to be bringing.
Yeah, that's been the highlight amongst other things as well. Yeah. So
I fully expect that to hit the ground running. Obviously, not literally, because they don't want to hit the ground, but I expect it to work, and there'll probably be a Ferrari on pole. Obviously, I'm not going into predictions, because that's later in the episode. And I expect Max to be chasing that Ferrari all the way through the race. But as I said, that's predictions. I'm not going to get into my predictions yet.
Yeah, we'll get to that towards the end of the episode. Sean, just to bring you in on this one as well, there's been a lot of talk on social media, and particularly news stories between Ferrari and Red Bull having a back and forth over who has actually spent what on their upgrades so far and on their cars so far. And the narrative, at least from Ferrari, seems to be that Red Bull has spent quite a hefty chunk of their allotted budget for the season on upgrades, to a point where they can't sustain this level of upgrade in their car compared to the Ferrari throughout the course of the season. What are your thoughts on this? Do you feel that this is just like what we saw last season between Red Bull and Mercedes, where it's just going to go back and forth race by race until we have an eventual winner? Or do you think there's some merit to what Ferrari are saying, to a degree where they're even prepared to put out a dossier with estimates of what everyone's been spending, apparently? I have no idea how they know that, but there we go.
Well, it is very interesting that Ferrari would know that, of course, because we never found out what the results of that FIA settlement was in 2019 concerning their power unit. So why Ferrari would want to, poke the bear, I don't know. But the financial regulations, it's unprecedented. It's uncharted territory for Formula One. We've never been in this situation before where you had to actually keep the receipts for everything you did, and it can actually infringe upon your development program in the middle of a new set of regulations. So I have no precedent to lean on and say this is usually how it goes. I do have precedents when it comes down to the political shenanigans, and that is all in a day's work for Formula One. Colin Chapman once defined Formula One as a game of political espionage interrupted every 2 weeks by a race, which is the perfect definition of how Grand Prix racing works. All this back and forth is par for the course. That will carry on all season. I also think it will carry on all season on the racetrack itself, because the cars are so evenly matched. The Red Bull doesn't seem to be as strong on one lap pace. The Ferrari seems stronger of single lap, but in race pace, it ticks the other way. If you're getting into predictions, I don't know if am I jumping the gun a little bit if I start to talk about how things might work in Barcelona?
Well, we can go through. So what we tend to do at the end of the episode, Sean, is we ask for your top three and a bold prediction. So something completely random. But of course, you can go into certain details in that, and then we can come to that later on if you want to sort of stamp that down.
I don't want to spoil the big denouement. The way I see it going is based on what I know at the moment. I would expect Ferrari to be quicker in qualifying. And then again, it comes down to can Verstappen in particular pass Leclerc? We've obviously seen several examples of that happening. Verstappen in Jeddah and in Miami didn't lead any of the sessions until the race. It is not unusual for Red Bull to be lagging behind Ferrari until the cards actually go on the table. So I wouldn't be too concerned if they are again lagging in qualifying. What is concerning is the Circuit de Barcelona Catalunya is the most important pole position of the year. Now you might think, well, hang on a minute, he's sitting in Monaco saying that Spain is more important for pole position than Monaco. Statistically speaking, I think something like 28 out of 31 races in Barcelona have been won from the front row of the grid. If you are not on the front row, you're toast. So as a Ferrari front row lockout, it becomes very, very difficult, statistically at least, for Verstappen to envisage winning the race. Therefore, it comes down to how easy it is to pass. And Barcelona is not the easiest circuit on which to pass. Verstappen himself passed and Hamilton on that track. So it's doable. I would still say Ferrari should still have an edge on a track that is the most handling-based track that we visit in the World Championship. But Red Bull have this definable straight line speed advantage. They've been fastest. Perez's car's been fastest in the track at every single Grand Prix. Verstappen's been second fastest behind him 3 of the first 5. So down the straight, they're looking great. And also, if Red Bull end up in the lead, we haven't seen Ferrari pass the Red Bull. So once it gets in the lead, it stays in the lead, generally speaking. It's always a case of Verstappen trying to pass Leclerc, but when it comes to the other way around, not so much of a thing. So track position, yeah, big deal and in Spain, especially if Verstappen's in the lead. I think if Verstappen gets in the lead, he's going to keep the lead.
Yeah.
So it's I don't see it. Put it this way, I don't see a situation. Maybe I'm jinxing myself. Maybe you're going to replay this to me on Twitter over the weekend. I don't see a situation where Red Bull will be ahead of Ferrari in qualifying, but I'm sure they've got other ideas. We don't know what the upgrades are going to be like, so that's my disclaimer. We don't know how good the upgrades will be. They might be absolutely ninja upgrades, and they'll just sail off into the sunset.
Well, I don't mind the extra clout if people want to replay clips from this, but certainly not at your expense, Sean. Hopefully not. I mean, if anyone wants any sort of indication on how critical pole position is at Spain, just ask Pastor Maldonado. Obviously, it's just gone 10 years since his first win in F1 and only win, and of course,
yes,
it was
actually, actually, by sheer coincidence, it's the 10th anniversary of his first win. It's also the 200th Grand Prix since that win. Williams haven't won since then, so it's simultaneously 2 anniversaries at the same time. But yeah, Maldonado won from pole after the original pole sitter, Lewis Hamilton, fastest in qualifying, was excluded for having an insufficient fuel sample.
That's right.
Another example of a driver quickest in qualifying not being on pole position. Just saying. So
the omens, if we can infer from what they're saying, suggest to us that Nicholas Latifi is going to win this weekend's Grand Prix.
Get £100, Nicholas Latifi for the win. Actually, I wrote a stat this week that Alex Albon's start to his Williams career, I think that's the best start for a Williams driver to their first season at the team since Felipe Massa in 2014. Wow. Later that year, Massa was on pole in Austria, and he was on the podium 3 times. So that was me trying to provide something to Williams that says, "Hey, if you need something that has a bit of a wow factor, go with this one, because this is something where like, wow, okay."
It's almost a bit bittersweet, isn't it, for Williams to sort of hear that?
Like, Sean, do you see it going that far? No, but it sounds good.
Oh no,
it'd be fantastic if it does, but put it this way, it's good that we're talking about Williams in terms of making a flying start to the season. With points in 2 races. Could have had points at Imola as well. Could have had even more points in Austria, but they had a botched pit stop. The pit stop that Albon had on the last lap of the race was at 4.5 seconds. If it had been 2.5 seconds, he would have been in DRS range of Gasly, and he could have been 9th. But there we go. It's good that Williams are actually fighting for points.
Yeah, absolutely. Just on the subject, obviously you've talked about Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen. And obviously, that was a really good analysis, because I think it's quite critical that we haven't really seen a clean pass yet from Leclerc on Verstappen. So far, we've seen Leclerc re-overtake Verstappen almost immediately in the following DRS section. We saw that in Bahrain a few times. We saw that in Jeddah, but he hasn't made an actual clean pass on him when he's been chasing him. And I feel at the moment, whilst the battle between the two of them has been rather respectful in that regard, there's been a lot of respect between the two compared to similar to what we had between Lewis and Max last season, before it sort of all exploded, if you like, at Silverstone when they came together. With everything brewing in the background between Ferrari and Red Bull right now, and it seems to be growing in intensity race by race, with a back and forth in money, and Helmut Marko having digs at Carlos Sainz crashing the car, saying Ferrari have obviously got to spend money on spare parts and stuff like that. Do you feel that this is something that could spill over quite emphatically if and when those Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen have a collision, when they decide to not give each other the space that they need if they go for broke?
This is a case of when. I mean, it always happens. Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost had a very respectful relationship until they didn't. It's always a case of, oh yeah, I like racing with that guy, but he totally ran me off the road and cost me the race win that time, and now I hate him. So it always goes that way. And just as the two teams might be at each other's throats saying, hang on a minute, you can't spend this kind of money, you're getting a competitive advantage, blah, blah, blah. So it will be between the drivers. Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen didn't have a problem until suddenly there was a world championship up for grabs. And that totally changed. That changes a lot in the psyche. Because you've got to bear in mind, in Leclerc's case, especially after the doldrums that Ferrari have been in, you've got to think to yourself, I can't guarantee that I'll get another chance to win a world championship. Verstappen's already won one. If he retired now, if Verstappen did nothing else with his career, he always, forever and a day, I'm the world champion. Leclerc, on the other hand, he's only got 4 Grand Prix victories. So he's still on the up and up, so to speak. It is ridiculous how little success Leclerc has had relative to his amount of talent in the 4 years that he's been in F1. But that's not me to say that Leclerc's underperformed, because I think what he did in 2020, especially with that dog of a Ferrari, was sensational. And he put that Ferrari in positions it shouldn't have been. Basically, inflicted terminal damage on Sebastian Vettel's reputation at Ferrari because he was that good. And now is his big chance at winning a championship. And I was just, as you were saying that, I was thinking to myself, if Leclerc leads away from the line in Catalunya and Verstappen's alongside, if I'm Leclerc, I'm thinking, I must not let this guy go past, because I know if he does, I haven't been able to get back past him. And this is a really hard track to do that anyway. So it's one of those instances where Leclerc may need to get the elbows out into turn 1. Now, that's not easy when you're dealing with Max Verstappen, because Max Verstappen, with significant, he has a great reputation for exciting passes, going for the move, which I love. He is this generation's Gilles Villeneuve or Nigel Mansell. He's the guy where, if there's anyone who will just throw it up the inside and go for it, it's Max. And that's what makes him so exciting. However, when you're Leclerc, you've got to think, if I squeeze this guy, he may still go for it. And we risk having an accident. It's Senna. Senna was like that as well. It was always like, give me the room or we're having an accident.
Yeah, well, we've not seen Max sort of give any way. He's just
and it's been a successful strategy, but obviously it pisses off his rivals from time to time. And actually, one of the points I would make when I would be hosting at the racetrack last year was the difference between Max and Lewis was never pace. Lewis, pound for pound, could go every bit as quick as Max. That was never the thing. To me, it was Lewis's ability to see the long game and think, I don't want to throw it up the inside here necessarily and have an accident. And the Silverstone accident actually was a great example of one time where he threw caution to the wind, because in the sprint, he'd had the exact same situation and he'd gone to the outside at Copse and didn't get past him. And then he was stuck behind Max all day. So in the Grand Prix, he was like, I'm going to the inside. and that's how the accident happened. But it was but again, it was an example of this is calculated risk by Lewis. With Max, it's just risk. It's just like, yeah, sling it up there. Let's see if we get a pass done. But the best example being the Yas Marina pass on lap 1, which was a pass. I still don't understand why Lewis kept the lead. Verstappen legitimately passed Lewis on the first lap. And Lewis didn't have to give that place back when he ran wide. But that's a pass that Lewis would never make, because he would look at that and say, if I do that, there'd be no points because I could damage the car and be out of the race. So I think Lewis is a more thoughtful driver. Max Verstappen is a more seat of the pants instinct driver.
And yet the two of them blend together so nicely when they're sort of together on track. You always sort of worry when they go together last season. And hopefully we get some more of that again. But obviously, with a view to that being not having the same end results. But I guess you can't have one without the other half the time. Lee, let's move on to Checo and Carlos Sainz. Last time out in Miami, Checo pretty unlucky to have those issues with the car that obviously prevented him from overtaking Sainz, or at least trying to get close enough to him where they could overtake him. Sainz had a much better Sunday and Saturday, it must be said, in Miami. The best weekend he's had overall for quite a while. So what are you expecting from those two? Bear in mind, of course, Carlos Sainz will bet his home race, and I'm pretty sure he'll be out there to try and impress.
I'm expecting Carlos to take the result from Miami, going, it's a bit of a confidence booster. He's underperformed by his own standards, but as you said, it wasn't a bad weekend last time out, and he can be okay. I've stopped crashing. I've stopped making silly mistakes. Let's build on this. Let's it's his home Grand Prix. You said, let's go for the win. Win at home. Obviously, Sean can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but he will want to be the first Spaniard that's not Fernando Alonso to win a race. I think that's correct.
That is exactly as it is written for the broadcasters this weekend. So you'll hear it said verbatim on the air this weekend.
So I'm glad I got that one right. That would have been embarrassing. So yeah, he'd be going.
Well, hang on a minute. In terms of the Spanish Grand Prix, I should say, I wrote it specifically. Like, he's trying to be the first driver from Spain, not called Alonso, to be on the podium in the Spanish Grand Prix as well. So there's that too.
Oh, wow. I thought you were going to say that was wrong there. Thank you.
No. Carry on.
I was immediately thinking of Pedro De La Rosa, then thinking, did he do something that I've completely forgot about? Because that would be memorable if he did.
De La Rosa was on the podium at the Hungarian Grand Prix of 2006.
There you go.
Also, Fondi Portago. I know you're big fans of Afonso Di Portago. Silverstone 1956 shared drive, finished second. That was the only podium.
Was that the one with Fangio as well? I
believe it was a Fangio drive. I should know this. I've forgotten off the top of my head. But yeah, it was a shared drive. So half a podium finish for Spain between 1950 and 2003 when Alonso came along and scored. He scored 98 of them now.
So, oh wow!
They're certainly waiting.
Because this weekend's 9 years since Alonso won a race, which is staggering.
That's crazy. That is crazy, and it's funny because I remember that so vividly, especially the start of that race, and obviously the crowd reaction, how it went from there. But yeah, of course, it's going to be a big weekend for both Sainz and Checo. Sean, what are your thoughts on these two? Because it almost feels like whilst Checo and Sainz recently have obviously upped their game in the machinery that requires it, especially Checo, it does feel that they are the supporting act right now to Leclerc and Verstappen. In this race, do you see that sort of continuing, or do you feel that there's still room for those two, if they have a weekend where they can put it all together, to try and go for the win themselves?
Yes, in Checo's case, there had been a systematic problem at Red Bull, which has started to brew up in Daniel Ricciardo's last season, whereby the one car, the Verstappen car, was going great, but the second Red Bull was starting to get a little bit lost. And unfortunately, Pierre Gasly walked into that in 2019 and got hosed. And Alex Albon had to carry the can in 2019 and 2020. And it did reputational damage to their careers, which they've rebuilt by getting out of Red Bull. And excuse me, sorry, I don't mean to belch live on the air. That's not good. So Checo, you'll edit that out, won't you?
Maybe.
So Checo Perez, maybe, right. Yeah, then maybe that will go viral. So Checo Perez in 2021 came into that same situation. And with all his experience, obviously thought, look, there's still something idiosyncratic about this car that's not to my taste. In 2022, we have a situation where Perez has been on pole position. He's been in top 4 on the grid at every race. That idiosyncrasy appears to have been dialed out. Whatever was making those drivers, who were all very good drivers, not comfortable in that car, seem to have gone away. And now we've got 2 Red Bulls in the fight. And that wasn't necessarily a problem at Ferrari, but it will make a big difference for Verstappen, because there was too many occasions last year where there was only 1 Red Bull up against 2 Mercedes. And we saw in Yas Marina, when Checo Perez was left out at his pit stop, before his pit stop, that having that extra Red Bull there makes a big difference in terms of strategy calls and what you can do and what you can't do and so on. So that's a big difference. Carlos Sainz, who has scored points in every Spanish Grand Prix in which he has started, he's always been Mr. Consistency, and then it all sort of went off the rails, almost literally, in Australia, in Imola, because he completed 1 lap in 2 Grand Prix after a run of 17 consecutive points finishes and 31 consecutive race finishes. All of a sudden, he turned into Calamity Jane, going off in the sand pit everywhere in qualifying and in the race. I would expect more normal Carlos Sainz this weekend. He's dare I say it, a very smooth operator at this racetrack.
Very nice.
And obviously, this is the first time that he has a genuinely race-winning car in his home Grand Prix. And, a lot of drivers up their game, even if they say they didn't. It is a difference. I mean, we haven't had a crowd. We haven't had a crowd at the Spanish Grand Prix since 2019. So it's going to make a big difference to him to race in front of his own fans. So yeah, I'm sure he'll be inspired. Hopefully not too much so. Hopefully he doesn't make mistakes because he's just driving a bit too hard. Certainly the speed of Perez in the first 5 races would suggest that Carlos feels like he will have a point to prove. He won't want people to think, well, he's the support act for the main player, which, I mean, Checo Perez came into Red Bull knowing that was the case. But he rescued him from having no drive at all, which would have been very unfair. So now Perez is getting to the point where he actually is part of the battle. He's not as quick as Max, but he is, he's not 40 seconds behind, not a complete pit stop behind. So he is actually relevant to race strategy. Well,
that's it, isn't it? Because, we've seen some crazy things in the past, and Ferrari pulling out certain team order tricks. Austria 2001 and 2002 come to mind. I can't imagine even Ferrari would even dare pull something like that with Carlos Sainz winning the race, and you've got Charles Leclerc in P2. I mean, actually, I'll put this to both of you guys. Lee, would Ferrari do that if you had Leclerc in P2, Sainz P1 in Spain, and you've got Max Verstappen in P3? Because right now, obviously, with the championship lead closing at the rate that it is, you'd almost feel like Ferrari eventually do have to make a decision on who to back in this championship. So what do you think? Would they dare do something like that in front of Sainz's home crowd?
I have to think, at the moment, in this part of the season, I would have said no, they wouldn't do it, because I still think it's too early in the season. But I would also raise the point from the sponsorship side of things, being in the Spanish Grand Prix, and if it was in that order, being the Santander being one of the big sponsors, they don't really want to offend a sponsor this early in the season either, at the home Grand Prix of that sponsor. So I would have said no, they wouldn't consider it just yet. But if the Spanish Grand Prix was later in the season, then I think they would definitely consider doing it.
What about you, Sean? Do you share Lee's thoughts on that, or do you think Ferrari may just think, forget all the sponsors and that, we need to try and win a championship here? Because it's been so long since Ferrari have won a Drivers' Championship or Constructors' Championship, for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, I largely concur with what Lee said. You have to bear in mind, this is the longest World Championship in history. 23 races, we're 5 races down, so we've got 18 races to go. That used to be a complete season, 18 races. And the other thing that people perhaps don't consider is that there's another 16 points to be earned in sprints this year. So you've got to put that on the top. So you've got 18 races plus another 16 points on the table for sprint format. So there's so much that can happen, and the order can change so fast that it might not be wise yet to put everything on the one horse. It might be a good idea to keep, to keep an open mind on that one. I'd understand it, as Lee mentioned, if it were later in the season, then sure. But right now, I'd hedge your bets, because you don't know where it's going to go. But of course, it might be self-policing, because if Leclerc's in the lead, as he has been at every race, compared to Sainz, it's not going to become a problem. I think Ferrari, this is a problem that Ferrari would like to have, because if you've got a situation where you've got 2 very competitive Ferraris, that's a lot better than 2020. Didn't even lead a lap in 2020. It's only the third time in the history of the World Championship Ferrari went a whole year and didn't lead a lap. We got 200 bonus points to anybody out here who can tell me the other 2 years.
Yeah, well, it's not going to come from us, unfortunately, not at the top of our head. So I'm going to leave that one to our followers in the comment section on YouTube, because they'll have a lot more time to try and fact check this one. But though, if you do check it, guys, and you do get it from Google, you have to put it in the comments so we can half those points, because we can't. It has to be fresh from memory. No cheating, but we'll allow it, but we'll have to take half those points off. Let's move on to Mercedes, guys. It's quite a big weekend for them. I mean, is this make or break for them? Because they've obviously been putting some upgrades onto their car. They thought after Friday practice in Miami that they had made some steps forward, perhaps not as much as they'd thought. But then when everybody found more speed, when the track conditions changed, Mercedes didn't. They felt backwards, almost to a point where they were basically where they were when they left off. So there's a lot of emphasis now on this huge upgrade package that they're bringing to Barcelona, with a view to it being able to allow them to understand certain nuances or facets of their car that is causing them to struggle so much, to a degree where they either commit to this current concept that they have or rip everything up and start again with perhaps adopting a concept that's working for one of the other teams. What are your thoughts on this one, guys? Is this really a make or break weekend for Mercedes? Lee, I'm going to start with you on this one.
I think it is a completely make and break weekend. I know I've been pointing to this race for the last few episodes. But as another point to consider is this is where they ran their side pod concepts in the first test around this track, so they can actually compare their zero pod and an actual side pod concept and see if they actually have better lap time compared to what they did in testing. Obviously, if the upgrades work, then they know they're in the right track. But at some point, they're going to have to decide if they're going to abandon it completely. And I think that this is the weekend that's going to reinforce any decision they make going forward.
And what about you, Sean? Is this weekend critical for Mercedes' season?
I wouldn't say it's critical. I would say it's not critical in terms of can they turn things around. It's not make or break in that regard. What it is make or break in terms of is a measurement of where Mercedes really are, because no track gives us the barometer of Mercedes pace like this one. They've been on pole position here the last 9 years in a row. Now that's a record. It's tied with Silverstone. They did 9 pole positions in a row at Silverstone, but 2 of those were in the same year, 2020, when we had the 2 races there. So this is the only track ever where a constructor's been on pole 9 consecutive years. Hamilton's won the last 5 in a row here. That's only been done once ever in championship history, and that was Ayrton Senna here in Monaco. So if Hamilton were to win this weekend, it would be 6 in a row. No one's ever done that in F1. It is the defining element of Mercedes, is that they can get around Barcelona better than everybody else. I mean, the last time they didn't win was when the 2 idiots crashed into each other on the first lap in 2016. Other than that, generally speaking, nobody touches them. It was telling last year that Verstappen was able to fight Lewis for so long, and that was really that was the indicator of the championship that we ultimately got, that Verstappen was so close to Lewis at a track where Mercedes, it was usually a walk in the park on a Sunday afternoon for them. So this year, where they are this weekend, this is this is where they really are. In Miami, there's a situation where the car was very fast on Friday, which is great, but you may not be going for ultimate pace on Friday. When the car moved when they were trying to push ultimate pace out of that car, it became extremely unpredictable. Every time George Russell and Lewis Hamilton could not get all 3 sectors of the lap done correctly, all in the same lap. I added up all of their theoretical best sectors. George Russell should have been easily in Q3. Hamilton should have at least been ahead of Bottas. He should have at least been best of the rest behind them, the Red Bull and the Ferraris, and wasn't. Because when they push the car to the ultimate limit, it just doesn't, it's not consistent. It doesn't give the driver the confidence to push, and they end up making these mistakes that were not otherwise prevalent, even in the race, because obviously you don't really push the car to its absolute limit in race pace. So it would be really telling to see where they really are now, because this is as close as Formula One can get to sort of laboratory conditions at this racetrack. So if they're 6th on the grid and one car is out in Q2 again, we can define this as being a bit of a write-off because this is the one place where they have always been able to dominate. And I would like to think that Mercedes is in some way excited to see what that is, because instead of sort of scratching their head and thinking like, well, in Miami we've not raced here before, and Emilia Romagna, it was wet last year, and Jeddah's new and all that sort of stuff. Now, we didn't race in Australia the previous year. Now it's like, okay, we know this track. We know exactly where we should be. And we tested here in pre-season. Where are we? And on that basis, we'll probably define their decision-making process. Like, are we going to revert back to a year previous? Are we going to write this season off and say, look, we're not going to be able to fix this? Yeah. There are things that hinge on that. There's a lot of decisions that will hinge on that, but I'm not saying that their season is done, because these are new regulations, and when you have new regulations, it's very easy to pick up huge chunks of time through very small changes, which wouldn't have happened in 2021 when the regulations have been stable and you're picking like little tiny incremental benefits. Now you have a new set of regulations. Suddenly you can change one thing on the car and suddenly unlock a lot of pace that wasn't there. The best example is McLaren, 13th and 18th on the grid at Bahrain, on the podium at Imola. So all of a sudden, they could say, just change that from there to there, half a second a lap. All of a sudden, it's like, oh wow, it's fixed. I remember Mario Andretti once telling a story of when he was testing for Lotus, when he was winning the World Championship with them, and they had two supposedly identical chassis with a slight difference in the suspension geometry. He said one car is amazing. I could do anything with that car. The other car is absolutely horrendous and undrivable. That's what we're talking about. Like, it's literally like, hang on a minute, move that to there. And suddenly the driver's going to be like, holy cow, this is a brand new car. It's like nothing we did before was relevant. This is completely different. I think that's where Mercedes are. There's a magic fix that they just haven't been able to isolate. And once they get it, the other teams are going to wish they scored more points in this period.
Well, this is the telling thing, isn't it? Because it almost does feel that Mercedes, at some point, they're going to find that magic switch, as you say, be able to find whatever it is, find that extra performance to get up there. I mean, in some cases, you could argue that, this is just one of those times where the regulations have affected them to a certain degree. And of course, what happened the season before in terms of how much time they were allowed to sort of research and develop to a point where perhaps they've got a concept that other teams have looked at and decided, actually, that's not the one that carries the greatest potential for us. And we don't know at this point. I mean, it's Mercedes, so they're definitely the best team, I think, that could be in this position and actually come through it. I think better than others. I think they've shown through history that that's what they're capable of. The last 8 years or so would be a testament to that. But you raised a good point there, Sean, about we're going to the first circuit since Bahrain, you could argue, where Mercedes are coming to a track where we've had testing experience with these cars this season. Obviously, there are other caveats at other circuits where they'd either not been there before or they hadn't been there for some time, or it's a new circuit. So Mercedes are in a position, as I said, since Bahrain, where they've got a car where they could be as close to the front two teams as they were in Bahrain. They were the standout third fastest, like Bottas in Alfa Romeo, for example, or the McLarens, weren't even a factor there. So they could be in that position, and of course, could be even closer if these upgrades have the desired effect. We'll have to wait and see. On the subject of Russell and Hamilton, because obviously there's been that growing dynamic between the two over the master in Lewis, the heir apprentice in George Russell. And of course, Russell has certainly had the rub of the green in terms of strategies and safety cars. And I don't think we've had a race so far this season that hasn't had a safety car. So assuming that another one is on the way in Spain, it almost feels like right now something needs to go Lewis's way in terms of strategy. Perhaps not just to sort of make him feel better about how things are going at the moment, but just to retain that harmony within the team. Because at the moment, it must feel like a bit of a struggle for Lewis right now when he's doing the best job that he feels he can in a car that is proven to be very difficult for him to sort of get on top of. And yet his teammate might have a bad Saturday, but then can recover it on Sunday with the help of a safety car and the strategy working his way.
Well, when it comes to how drivers feel, I always say, look, you're getting paid 40 million euros to drive a Formula One car. I'm sure you can get over the incredible disappointments that you feel right now. Hamilton hasn't had this challenge to his authority. While Bottas was there, Bottas was always a number two. And Lewis knew it. That's the thing. It was like Mercedes never said it out loud. They never had to, because Lewis knew, I can beat this guy all day. This guy will never get close to me. Might beat me in qualifying. Great over one lap. Put 60 of them in a row. Different story. And the best example, the giveaway, was a quote after the Eiffel Grand Prix at the Nürburgring in 2020, when it was the only time really that Bottas really put manners on Lewis into turn one of a race. I mean, he really squeezed Hamilton almost off the track. And afterwards, Lewis was asked about it. Now, if that's Max Verstappen or Nico Rosberg, Hamilton would say that was uncalled for, or words to that effect. Instead, he said, I was proud of him for defending that way. Now, no driver ever says they're proud of another driver if they consider them to be a threat. He knew Bottas is never a threat. He knows that Russell's a threat. Russell, the real deal all the way through his junior career. Absolutely brilliant. One F3, one GP3 as it was then, one F2, both at the first attempt. That's Charles Leclerc territory we're talking about there. Was very impressive in a crap Williams. Never ever, he was always positive. I never saw one single instance in all those years at Williams where he criticized the team, said the car wasn't good enough, never threw his toys out the pram. It was always, how do we make it better? Now, unexpectedly, he's in that situation at Mercedes. And he's got a little bit more experience with it than Lewis, who's used to stepping straight into the best car on the grid in recent times. So Lewis suddenly, psychologically, is in new territory, whereas George isn't. And of course, George, as you mentioned, he's had a little bit better luck. Only guy to finish in the top 5 at every race this season. But we also know deep down that Russell has the pace to worry Lewis Hamilton. And even Nico Rosberg, I always felt Hamilton was a better driver than Rosberg, but Rosberg was great at getting under his skin. He psychologically, very Alain Prost in terms of knowing how to manipulate him psychologically. Russell's just playing fast. So it will be very interesting to see how that develops, and particularly if Mercedes solve the problem. If Hamilton's suddenly back in his comfort zone, will that dynamic change? I wonder. But it's fascinating times, not for the reasons that Mercedes wanted, but it is fascinating time to watch and see what's going on at Mercedes.
Yeah, very much so. And I'm really glad that you brought up that sort of the mentality element to it, especially with Nico Rosberg, because I think a lot of F1 fans don't appreciate how mentally strong and mentally tough Nico was, particularly in that 2016 season. I think that above anything else, and the fortune and the pace and everything else, that above anything else was what won him that world championship. And I totally understand the reasons for his retirement, because I don't think he could actually repeat what he had to go through to just get that done. So, and in George Russell, obviously we haven't seen stuff like that in him yet. We know he's got a steely, mature nature, certainly one beyond his years, with the pace to match right now. But of course, there will come a time when that will be tested in this inter-team battle with Lewis. That's when I think we'll start to see how well Mercedes can control that between their two drivers, because it's certainly one that is going to happen sooner rather than later, if it's not happening already. Lee, what are your thoughts on this one? Based on what Sean has just mentioned, and of course what's going on at Mercedes, where are your thoughts at with them this weekend? Is this sort of battle between Lewis and George starting to brew? And if so, will that affect their progress going forward?
Oh, it's definitely starting to brew. Lewis is not happy being beaten. No driver is happy at being beaten by their teammate, let alone a new driver coming in and beating the number one driver. We're starting to see the development of Mr. Saturday becoming Mr. Sunday, so to speak, because where he's outperformed Lewis on most of the weekends we've had this season, at least the race weekends. But that's been, as you said, there's been luck as well, and on the strategy and on the safety car, and not just his driving, but obviously his driving is putting him in those positions to take advantage of when the safety car arises. But if it goes on over the season, Lewis will not be happy, and obviously be pushing himself to beat George, and George will obviously be trying to maintain his championship lead over Lewis, which I can't actually recall how big the point gap is between the two of them at the moment.
I think Russell is 23
points. 23 points.
Yeah, so that's quite a sizable advantage George already has over Lewis. 5 races in. So yeah, it's only going to get worse for Lewis if George keeps it up.
Yeah. I'm mindful of time, guys, and I know, Sean, obviously we don't want to keep you longer than you've agreed to spend with us, so I'm going to blast through this midfield and ask for your predictions just at the very end. So we've got McLaren, who overall seem to be showing the most promise, at least in recent weeks. Lando Norris, it's more of a week-by-week thing. He's producing probably the most he can get out of this car. He was very unlucky in Miami. Strategy also didn't help him with that slow pit stop. Ricciardo has been improving, but not quite on the level that perhaps McLaren would want long-term, which has obviously led to him looking at other options, particularly Colton Herta, for example. Alpine, Ocon has been consistent, but not exactly spectacular, but the points are racking up for him, whereas Alonso's kind of on the other end of it, where he's really fast, but really inconsistent, or had some reliability issues with his car. Bottas has been the real underdog, if you like, and has been the real dark horse as well. He's been delivering some great performances in a car that right now is looking good. Zhou settling in nicely to his rookie season. And then we've got Aston Martin, who, of course, have had a huge upturn in form, surprising to a lot of us, and they're bringing their B-spec car, or at least Lance Stroll is getting that B-spec car rather than Vettel, so it'll be interesting to see the performance difference between those two this weekend. It'll be a bit embarrassing for Lance if he can't beat Vettel in that B-spec car, but we'll have to wait and see. AlphaTauri, of course, they've been on the fringes of points. Tsunoda and Gasly have been doing well, but they've been a bit misfortune, and obviously last week Gasly was very unfortunate with that incident with Norris, although it was his fault, albeit. And then we've got Williams, who we've already talked about. Albon impressive. Latifi, at the moment, not to be too harsh on him, when he finishes a race, I consider that an achievement at the moment. And Haas, you've got Mick Schumacher, who again has been underwhelming, but hopefully that will come. And then you've got Magnussen, who started off brilliantly and is sort of filtered back into that midfield. I've blasted through that really quickly. What I'm going to ask you both is, out of all of those drivers and teams right now, which of them are you expecting to have the best weekend? And is there a surprise package out of that cluster right now in that midfield? Sean, I'm going to come to you first.
Well, the surprise package, I guess, would be Lance Stroll, and because it's the unknown in terms of the Aston Martin. Because as you said, I mean, they started off badly, and they've recovered some of the form. But it remains to be seen how well he will do at this racetrack. I mean, he was in the top five. In fact, he was fourth, I think, in 2020 in the Racing Point, which is the artist that now known as Aston Martin. So, good results have come his way at this racetrack in the past. Other than that, Daniel Ricciardo, I think, is the guy with the pressure. Out-qualified by Lando Norris the last 9 in a row. This is not the driver they paid for. So, whatever's going wrong with Daniel Ricciardo needs to start going right sooner rather than later, because to use an American term, he is getting his ass handed to him by Norris at the moment.
I mean, on Ricciardo, is that more, in your opinion, is that down to Ricciardo just underperforming, or is Lando just performing to such a high level that it's making Ricciardo look worse than he actually is right now?
It ultimately has to be underperformance, because Ricciardo, lest we forget, put Vettel in the shade when Vettel was the reigning world champion in the first season of the hybrid era. And Ricciardo, in Verstappen's first season at Red Bull, they were evenly matched. In 2017, they were evenly matched. It started to diverge in 2018, which is what triggered Ricciardo's decision to depart the team, I think. So we know Ricciardo's good. And we also know that Ricciardo can be in a new team and psychologically handle the big cheese and the other side of the garage, because he went to Red Bull when Vettel and Red Bull, Red Bull was Vettel's team when he arrived, and it wasn't after that season. So there's an element of underperformance there. It seems to principally be relating to qualifying. He is not understanding that car as well as Norris, and it has this knock-on effect in the race, because if you're starting such a long way back all the time relative to your teammate, it can pile up. So it's tough times for Daniel Ricciardo fans right now. He definitely needs a good result, because Monza last year was an anomaly. That was his only podium finish of the year. Norris was the better driver last year, and so it is this year.
Yeah, and even then we never got to see what would have happened if they allowed him to fight. I mean, they were never going to do that. It was literally just Jordan Spa 1998 scenario all over again, with Damon Hill obviously telling Eddie Jordan to stop Ralph Schumacher from trying to fight him so that they could preserve that 1-2 that was kindly handed to them. But it is a very strange one with Ricciardo. I mean, overall with that midfield, Sean, if there's one driver out there that you think is going to win that midfield battle, who's it going to be? Is it going to be Lando, or perhaps will it be someone else that we haven't already mentioned?
Am I discounting Bottas from the midfield battle?
Well, I mean, I would say with respect to Bottas, obviously we talk about this as if like you've got Ferrari, Red Bull. I know they're in a battle of their own right now. Mercedes, one week they're sort of in that midfield, and another week they might be nipping at the heels of a Red Bull or a Ferrari, or perhaps on their own. So for the benefit of the argument, let's class Bottas in that midfield purely because, just in that cluster, I suppose. I can't think of a better way of putting it.
Right. But then Bottas is my man to watch because I mentioned how he was put in the shade by Lewis, but conversely to that, at the end of 2021, I said, what a pickup he's going to be at Alpha, because I thought Kimi was phoning it in for years at Alfa Romeo, basically trading on past glory. Now you're getting a driver that's getting turfed out of the championship winning car with a point to prove, who I'm convinced is very, very fast. He was very quick when he was at Williams. He was going to be a great asset to that team. All that knowledge, 5 or 6 years at Mercedes, going to Alfa Romeo, back of the grid team. Suddenly, it's like, okay, so here's where we've been going wrong. And so it has proven, because Guan Yu Zhou is where Alfa Romeo have been. That car is roughly where Alfa have been. It's Bottas who's been way up at the front. So he has been, arguably the driver of the season so far for what he's actually given to his team. And once again, much like with Gasly and with Albon, rebuilding a reputation that was somewhat damaged by being in a front of the grid car. There are certain drivers that seem to have a better time of life in these midfield cars as the underdog, as opposed to being the headline act, such as a Verstappen or Hamilton or a Leclerc.
I mean, does it seem like a surprise to you? I mean, it doesn't sound it that Valtteri Bottas is doing what he's doing right now, because I think a lot of people, F1 fans, were worried that Bottas may just slowly fade out for the remainder of his F1 career in the same way that Kimi Räikkönen did, and to some degree Sebastian Vettel is doing at the moment at Aston Martin.
I'd be lying if I said to you that I didn't expect that to an extent. I thought Bottas going to Alpha, that's great. Could get that car into Q3 here and there. I wasn't expecting him to be top 5. I wasn't expecting Alpha to be the 3rd fastest car in Miami. He should have been 5th in Miami, but he made that mistake, ran wide, hit the wall, and then Mercedes got past. The fact that Alfa Romeo are getting 7th place in a Grand Prix and thinking, damn it, we threw it away. That's light years ahead of where they were. They've been nowhere for years. It's been 10 years since the Sauber car's been on the podium. It seems staggering to say that, but they've been in the doldrums for most of the hybrid era, and now all of a sudden, they're in with a shot of being on the podium. We take a Ferrari and Red Bull catastrophe of some description, but the very fact that you could talk about that and see it as a realistic possibility, hats off to Valtteri Bottas, because it's not Guan Yu Zhou. You're not thinking, well, Guan Yu Zhou will be on the podium. Well, not based on what we've seen so far. Mitigating circumstances in Miami, got held up on his Q1 lap, didn't get a Q1. He's been sort of steady Eddie, but Bottas has been, to me, the standout driver of 2022 from the non-Red Bull Ferrari masses. And I can't quantify like the quantum leap that team and that driver have undergone.
And I absolutely agree with you. I'm absolutely loving seeing Valtteri version 7.7 that we've dubbed him for this season, but it's certainly working, all puns aside. Lee, let's come to you on this one. Obviously, we've listed out the midfield, obviously what's been going on with them right now. Who do you expect to be the king of the midfield this weekend? And are you expecting a surprise package from someone?
The king of the midfield, I reckon, is going to be Lando. Norris, obviously, I know McLaren, like all the other teams, are bringing upgrades, but I do remember in the pre-season testing how fast McLaren was at the circuit, that they were potentially the 3rd fastest team. And you may have another team that may outdevelop them, but I'm expecting a strong performance from McLaren this weekend, and Lando has been leading that charge. So I expect Lando to be up there, being the king of the midfield, so to speak. But the surprise package, I think, is going to be Aston Martin. How big a step up their B-spec car is going to be, because I think they're the only team that are bringing a B-spec car, from what I know. Obviously, there may be a surprise, and there may be another team bringing it. But a B-spec car is quite a overhaul. So let's see what performance that actually brings.
Yeah, I'm certainly looking to see how it looks. Sorry, Sean, you're going to weigh in there.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, cutting across the point there, one other person I want to put in the dark horse category is Esteban Ocon, who of course didn't actually do qualifying in Miami. He was 5th on the grid in Barcelona last year. So Given a decent weekend without any disruptions, we should also consider him as well.
Well, we should definitely give, I think, Lance Stroll more credit, because I was on someone else's show talking about the Miami race, and I think everyone was naming their driver of the race, and people were going, oh, Verstappen or Russell or, people like that. And I went, well, what about Lance Stroll? Because he qualified in Q3 that weekend, and I thought he was the best driver all weekend, pound for pound, because he qualified in Q3 in an Aston Martin, a car that on most circuits shouldn't be anywhere near that, managed to do it anyway. Started from the pits because of that old fuel temperature issue, meaning that they couldn't make the grid in time out of fear of being disqualified for their fuel being too cold. Still managed to drag that car back into the top 10 by the end of the Grand Prix. And I think that completely went over so many people's heads. So I don't often praise Stroll. I think a lot of Canadian followers that tune into this podcast, and we love you guys but we often joke at the expense of their drivers, particularly Latifi as well. So I think it's important to praise Stroll and Latifi as well on weekends when they deserve it. And they certainly did last time out.
I agree. Well, if I may add,
yeah,
I've always said Lance Stroll's a much better driver than people want to admit. I mean, he was a title-winning driver in the junior formula, and I know everyone. It's lazy to say, yeah, but Daddy bought him a Grand Prix team. As opposed to all these impoverished people who somehow overcome incredible hardship to become Formula One drivers. Like most F1 drivers that there have ever been came from very, very affluent backgrounds. He is no different in that regard. What he is different in is that he won championships in the junior level, and he's put in a number of excellent race drives. I still think he's a poor qualifier, but there are countless examples of Lance Stroll putting in great race performances, and Miami was just the latest example thereof.
And historically speaking, or I think from memory, there have been better qualifiers that have done less. And Lance has even got a pole position himself. I think I remember Turkey 2020. So there you go. I mean, it's funny, actually, you should mention sort of how good Lance Stroll is, or how some people underrate him. Because I think you and I have a mutual friend in Richard Spanish-Ready from Missed Apex. And he came up with one of the most interesting and thought-provoking statements regarding Lance Stroll's ability, and that he said that Lance Stroll, you could argue that he was better than Ayrton Senna if you take the concept of modern drivers being better than drivers of yesteryear, just because of how complex these F1 cars are compared to how they used to be. Now, a lot of people have very interesting opinions. That was probably one that certainly stuck to my mind, and I'm sure if you ever go back on their show, you might want to ask him about that one from me. Get his thoughts on that one.
I do understand the point he's making, which is, the modern driver will get the most out of the modern car. But if I put Lance Stroll in a 1986 Lotus on qualifying boost, there's only going to be one winner, because they don't need to know that talent. They don't need to heel and toe. They don't need to keep the boost pressure up. It's just, these are not things that they need to know. Just like if I put Senna in a 1955 Mercedes W196, he'd have been beaten by Fangio for the exact same reason. So I do get the point. And of course, sports science has moved on, psychologically, physically, and so on. Drivers are better than they've ever been. But as Isaac Newton said, if we've seen further, it's only because we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We've got to this level because of drivers like Fangio, then Senna, and then Lance Stroll. Fangio, Senna, Lance Stroll. That is the pyramid of greatness in F1 history, and we've arrived at Lance Stroll.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly a great shout. It's certainly one that brought a lot of people to debate on stuff like that, and I certainly understand where he came across with that. It was just, at the time when he told me, I was like, wow, I'm not quite sure how to respond to that at first, because my mind is like, you must be joking. Surely this is just sort of, I don't know, just fishing for responses. But there we go. Great mind.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We love you anyway, Richard. Don't worry. Look, let's go to our predictions. And obviously, Sean, thanks for sticking around with us. But we're at the very end of the episode now. The fun part, the exciting part, where all of our followers will start clipping, just in case I want to replay this back, in case we get them horribly wrong. But I'm going to ask you guys for your top three and a bold prediction, so you can be as wild as you like with this one. But Sean, seeing as you're our guest for this one, what's your top three? And give us a bold prediction from a statistician's perspective.
Top three is not going to be not going to be very exciting. I would say Leclerc, Verstappen, Sainz, which is not sticking my neck on the block exactly. Bold prediction. Let's see, what could we come up with that we haven't already? What ground that we haven't already covered? There must be something.
Well, I can come back to you if you want some time to think about
Yeah,
that.
give me a second to ruminate on that one and come back to me. I'll come up with something good.
Okay, Lee, I'm going to let you go before me because we often do this where I go first and steal your prediction or idea. So I'm going to give the floor to you on this one.
Okay, I'm going to go for a really crazy top three, backed up by a crazy bold prediction. Well, I think it's crazy by my standards. So I would have said Carlos, Charles, and Lewis. And Max isn't on the podium. That's my bold prediction.
That's very bold. Very bold. So obviously you're quite confident that Mercedes are going to find something.
Yeah, I'm hoping so.
Either that or Max and Charles have a moment together and Max
ends up... There is that as well.
Yeah, could always be that. Okay, I'll give mine before we go back to Sean. I agree with Sean's top three. I'm going to go Charles to win, Max second, and Carlos Sainz in P3. Bold prediction. It's a hard one, but I'm going to go really bold and go Mick Schumacher finally gets points this weekend. I know he's been on the fringes and he's been a bit unlucky and he's made a few mistakes, but I'm gonna back him for this one. I think Mick Schumacher to get points this weekend. So back to Sean then. It looks like he's got a bold prediction for us. I'm looking forward to hearing this one. What do you got, Sean?
All right. So forget what I just said. Right, that podium that's never happened. Right. So new podium. New podium is my bold prediction, and I'm going to use a little bit of virtual Statman magic dust on this one. It's going to be Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, and Valtteri Bottas. And here's the reason why. They've been the podium finishers here the last 4 years in a row. This is the only track in the history of the World Championship where the podium finishers have been the same three guys 4 years running. Therefore, it has to be the same three guys again. It's going to be Verstappen, Hamilton, Bottas.
And is that the most common F1 podium that we've ever had as well?
Yes, it is. They finished on the podium 20 times together. The first time was Spain 2018, coincidentally. The next highest total is 14, and that was Hamilton, Rosberg, Vettel, if my memory serves me right. So yes, here's to the 21st occasion thereof and the 5th glorious year of Verstappen, Hamilton and Bottas on the same podium at the same racetrack. Thanks for coming, everybody. We didn't say it was predictable.
Well, Spanish Grand Prix can sometimes often be, but nonetheless, that's why we love F1. We keep tuning in because you just never, ever know, even if you've got all the stats to back up the contrary. Sean, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for spending time with us. A bit longer than we'd obviously agreed originally, but we appreciate that. Where can our followers find you on the socials?
If you want to hear me talk about Formula One ad infinitum, you can follow me on Twitter at VirtualStatman. And if you want to see pictures of where I am in the Formula One universe, you can follow me on Instagram at VirtualStatman. I have much more followers on Twitter than I do on Instagram, which I think is an interesting case study of the difference between how much people want to listen to me versus how much people want to look at me.
It depends on who you are. I can imagine that's probably the same for a lot of us mere mortals, but it is an interesting dynamic that I feel like...
I all my best pictures are on my OnlyFans page. So.
There you go. You've got to subscribe for that sort of stuff. That stuff don't come cheap. And but I imagine it's probably worth it. It's mostly just pictures of Monaco and racetracks, which, if anything, is probably worth it, I suppose. Not that I would know.
There are worse ways to spend a day.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I was sort of looking through some of the pictures you were sending me on of F1 tracks. I should stress, nothing to do with OnlyFans.
Yes,
like
moving quickly along.
Yeah, that's it. That's how these new relationships work, I suppose. Got massive FOMO. So no, fair play. It looks absolutely stunning out there. Maybe.
I hope I have helped by bringing a little bit of Monaco to the podcast this evening.
Oh, definitely. I'm sure our audio listeners will obviously need to check it out on YouTube just to get the full picture as well, rather than just hearing the backgrounds. But it's been fantastic anyway, Sean, and we really appreciate you coming on. Lee, have we got any final thoughts before we sign off?
I'm just very awed by the stats the virtual Statman's managed to bring. It's been a pleasure having you on, Sean, so thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me, guys.
That's been brilliant. Of course, Sean, we'll love to have you back in the future. When that will be, of course, we'll have to talk about that. But until next time, guys, I hope you enjoyed the episode. We certainly did. We certainly enjoyed recording this one, so I hope you enjoyed it too. If you did, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the podcast. We've got the live stream watch along of the Spanish Grand Prix qualifying at 3 p.m. UK time, or 2:45 just beforehand. So make sure to join us for that on the DNF1 YouTube channel. If you have enjoyed the podcast on your audio platform, of course, you can also give us a nice review and consider following us on there as well. We really appreciate your support. And until next time, guys, thank you so much. Please take care. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. Take care.
Goodbye.